Willard forgot to turn off the background sound during his live stream for his friends. A playful girl's voice came through the picture. "You ruined my underwear again. Can you stay with me for one more day? I don't want you going back to that old woman." A friend kindly reminded him, saying, "Aren't you afraid I'll hear it and make a scene?" Willard snorted. Does she have any other methods besides these? Indeed, if it were before, I would have definitely cried, made a scene, and even threatened to hang myself. But this time I simply liked the post and didn't make a sound. Willard called me. "My flight's delayed, don't wait for me to have dinner." His voice was calm and indifferent on the phone. Even his explanation felt a little cold. If this had been before, hearing those words, I would have definitely said, "It's okay, I'll wait for you to get home." Then I would have gone on and on to fill his waiting time with idle chatter. But now, I just responded faintly. I didn't even say, "Be careful on the road." Because last night before bed, I was scrolling through Willard's Instagram. It was strange, someone like him, who didn't even want to post anything about marriage, actually updated his IG one day. I clicked on it eagerly, planning to give him a like after reading. But then, I heard the voice in the picture. Willard had forgotten to turn off the background sound in the livestream. The sweet voice of a girl stood out clearly. "Are you reporting to that old woman again? Ugh, you ruined my underwear again. Can you stay with me for one more day? I don't want you going back to that old woman." At first, I thought it was a couple of sweet strangers. Until I scrolled to the last picture. Willard's low, indulgent laugh came through. "I'll buy you new ones." Since I've known Willard, he's always been like a cold, aloof flower, elegant, reserved, and introverted. I've always thought someone like him could never say such ambiguous things openly. After all, I've said all sorts of sweet things to him in the past. Every time, he would frown and interrupt with, "Miranda, could you be a little more reserved?" Willard seemed surprised by the single-word response from me. He probably wanted to say something more. But I had already hung up the phone. What he didn't say, he could only message me. "I'll bring you a gift when I come back." What do you want? This was his way of making up, or maybe testing me. After Willard posted that Instagram last night, one of his friends noticed the content of the background sound. They left a comment in the post. "Aren't you afraid Miranda will hear this and cause a scene?" Willard quickly replied. Does she have any other methods besides these? Even through the screen, I could feel the disdain and sneer in his tone. He probably forgot that I knew about his IG account. I could see their comments. Indeed. If it were before, I would have definitely cried, made a scene, and even threatened to hang myself. Because I really liked Willard, I even had a pathological possessiveness about him. In the past, whenever a young woman appeared around him, I would be on high alert. Willard hated it. We tortured each other this way, but still coldly stayed together for 3 years. When we got married, I even thought, no matter what, I would be with him for the rest of my life. But it's only been 3 years. And suddenly, I'm tired. I calmly liked Willard's post and then turned off my phone to sleep. When I woke up, Willard's IG post had already been deleted. And then came the phone call saying his flight was delayed. I checked the flight schedule. The weather in his city was fine. There were no flight delays. The only excuse he could have was the girl in the background sound. Willard arrived home at midnight. When he saw me lying on the couch, his usually expressionless face showed a flash of surprise. "Didn't you say you wouldn't wait for me?" I hadn't been waiting for him. I had just fallen asleep while recalling the little moments between us. Willard handed me a gift bag. "I brought you a gift." I was a little surprised, thinking he was just saying it casually before. Willard asked me to open it. It was a small figurine, very cute. But it didn't seem like the kind of gift he would pick. Suddenly, that sweet, playful voice came to my mind. Willard stared at me. He seemed to be waiting for me to say something. But I just stuffed the gift back into the box. "Thank you." When he didn't see the expected reaction on my face, Willard frowned and looked at me. "Don't you have anything to say to me? You should keep the noise down when you wash up. I need to rest, don't disturb me." Willard's frown deepened. Looking back, what did he expect me to say? Did he want me to ask about the live stream? Or to ask who the girl was that he brought with him on his business trip? But none of that mattered anymore. Not even Willard mattered anymore. The next day, Willard went to work. At noon, I suddenly received his call. "Miranda, didn't you bring me lunch?" Oh, right. Since marrying Willard, I'd always prepared lunch for him every day. Though Willard didn't like me, he was fond of the meals I made. These past few days I've been a bit busy, I didn't have time. Just order takeout. There was a sudden silence on the other end of the phone. A couple of days passed like this. Then, his family called. There was a family gathering tomorrow, and they wanted both of us to come back to the old house. I texted Willard. But he didn't reply. So I went to his office, but Willard was still in a meeting. "It's fine, I'll wait for him in his office." Willard's secretary looked at me as I walked toward his office. He reached out to stop me. Is there something else?" As I spoke, I had already pushed open the office door. A gray and white cat suddenly darted out from the office. "Ah!" I couldn't help but scream. When I saw that it was a British Shorthair, I froze. The secretary quickly picked up the cat and apologized. "Sorry, ma'am, I forgot to tell you, Mr. Willard has a cat." How could it be Willard's cat? "He has obsessive-compulsive disorder. When I wanted to have a dog at home, he refused." How could he be willing to keep a cat at the office now? And even let it into the office? The British Shorthair wore a peach-shaped love collar. No matter how you looked at it, the owner of the cat must be a woman. I don't know if it was to confirm my suspicions. But the next second, I heard the same playful female voice. "Today I brought shrimp corn and curry chicken. You should try it later." "Okay." "Ah. Honey. How did you get out?" Their conversation exploded in my ears like thunder. I turned around and saw a man and a woman walking towards me. A chill rose from my feet. The man was Willard. As for the woman, I don't think I'll ever forget her voice. It was exactly the same as the one from the background sound in Willard's IG post a few days ago. They were chatting and laughing. Because of their height difference, Willard slightly lowered his head to listen. His eyes and smile were filled with tenderness. When the woman saw the British Shorthair in the secretary's arms, her eyes lit up as she quickly stepped forward and took the cat in her arms. Willard's gaze followed her. His expression soft and indulgent. Until he slightly raised his eyes, his gaze cutting through the secretary and the woman's figures. He saw me standing at the door of the office. In that moment, his smile disappeared completely. The girl was completely unaware. She was playing with the cat in her arms while glancing over at Willard. "Willard, look." She noticed the sudden change in Willard's expression. It was as if, with some unspoken understanding, she turned to look at me at the same time. This time, I finally saw the girl's face clearly. Just as I had imagined. Young, playful, beautiful. Her eyes sparkled with a bright, shimmering light. The moment I saw her brows and eyes, I seemed to understand why Willard felt differently about her. Because she really looked so much like Willard's lost love. Willard had a girlfriend during his college years. She was well-educated, graceful, and gentle. They were the golden couple of the finance department, a story often talked about. Their breakup left many people feeling deeply regretful. Later, on the day before Willard and I were supposed to get married, she came to the wedding, but tragically died in a car accident on the way there. The sorrow in our marriage partly stemmed from that. All these years, I thought Willard had long forgotten her. But I never expected. The girl, still holding the cat, blinked in confusion before deeply scrutinizing me. "Jane, who is this?" She called the secretary by name. The secretary looked like she wanted to sink into the floor. She glanced at the girl, then at Willard. And explained, "This is Mrs. Willard." "Mrs.?" The girl repeated. A faint smile on her lips. Her young face held an air of pride, as if she were used to being adored. Clearly, she already knew who I was. The earlier question had been intentional. And finally, Willard snapped out of it and walked over to me. "You came?" His expression was flustered, and he unconsciously stood in front of me, blocking my view of her. He sure was protective. "I need to talk to you." Willard motioned for me to follow him to his office. It wasn't necessary, I just had one simple thing to say. But he seemed worried that I might cause a scene with his little lover in front of everyone. He opened the office door for me before I could even say a word. In the corner by Willard's desk was a makeshift cat bed. Some cat toys were scattered across the desk. I could almost picture Willard and that girl playing with the cat together in this office. Noticing my gaze, Willard explained. The cat belongs to one of the employees. I'm just watching it for them. How amusing. Who would dare ask him, the boss, to watch over an employee's cat? I didn't call him out on it. Willard, eager to change the subject, asked what I needed. Just as I was about to speak, the office door was knocked on. Willard, honey threw up, what should we do? Ethel rushed in, her voice trembling with panic. Willard's attention was immediately drawn to her. What happened? I don't know, it just happened all of a sudden. Willard took the cat from Ethel's arms. I watched as he gently comforted the British Shorthair in his arms. Some cat fur stuck to his sleeve and collar, but he didn't seem to notice. Take it to the vet first. Willard decided swiftly. As though the cat was his beloved child. I suddenly remembered a time when I had a fever and felt miserable. And asked him to drive me to the hospital. He had refused impatiently. Take a taxi, I'm busy. It turned out I couldn't even compare to that girl, let alone a cat. I sat there for no more than 3 minutes. Before Willard was ready to leave. This time, I couldn't hold back and called out to him. Willard. That's when he seemed to realize I was still there in the office. He was about to speak. But Ethel looked at me with teary eyes. Miss Miranda, I know you need to talk to Mr. Willard, but honey's really sick. If we don't get a doctor, it could die. I wasn't stopping them from seeing a doctor. And couldn't one person go alone? You've never had a pet, you don't understand. Honey's like my child. I beg you, let us take Honey to the vet first. Without saying a word, Ethel had already begun accusing me. Willard, not sure if he was more concerned for her or the cat, looked at me with a gaze full of reproach and frustration. As though I was being unreasonable and delaying their trip to the doctor. Miranda, whatever it is, we'll talk when I get back. No need, I just have one thing to say. I stood up and looked at Willard, who was frowning. Grandma's having a family dinner tomorrow. She wants us to come home for dinner. That was all. They could leave now. What was surprising was that Willard actually froze. He looked at me with a strange expression. That's it? What else? I reminded him kindly. You should hurry up, don't waste time saving the cat. Willard seemed taken aback. Looking at me as if he wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, it was Ethel who pushed him to leave. That night, Willard didn't come home. At midnight, I received a friend request on my phone. It was an anime cat avatar. I immediately knew who it was. After accepting, the person sent a picture of Willard petting the cat. Sorry, the cat's really clingy. She was young. And even her teasing had a touch of pride. I didn't respond, instead reminding Ethel not to forget to mention the family dinner to Willard. There was no reply. I had thought I would only see Willard at the old house the next day. But to my surprise, I saw his car before I left. I came to pick you up. When there's a free ride, why not take advantage of it? The passenger seat was spacious and clean. It seemed Willard had washed the car before picking me up. I leaned back, closing my eyes to rest. From time to time, I felt his gaze on me. In the past, whenever I sat in his car, I would chatter nonstop. Now, with my silence, the air in the car felt so still. Willard gripped the steering wheel, and his voice broke the silence. Miranda, Honey was really sick last night. I stayed at the hospital, which is why I didn't come home. He was explaining why he hadn't come home. Strange, he had never explained himself before. If I asked too much, he would get annoyed. But now, I didn't ask, and yet he was explaining. I know, someone already told me. Who told you? His voice sounded tense. The cat's owner. I answered truthfully. Willard glanced at me carefully. You mean Ethel? She's my new secretary in turn, and the cat was found downstairs in her building. She couldn't take it home, so. I know. I didn't want to hear his explanation. And cut him off. When he met my somewhat impatient and indifferent gaze, Willard was momentarily stunned. Miranda, why aren't you angry anymore? After we got out of the car, Willard reached out to hold my hand. I instinctively tried to pull away, but he held on tight. Grandma. Hearing his voice, I finally saw the elderly woman waiting at the intricately designed iron gate. That was Willard's grandmother. If it wasn't for her, I wouldn't have married Willard. I was good at making her laugh. And she always said she wanted me to marry her grandson so she could be happy every day. At the time, Willard and I were at a standstill in our relationship because of his lost love. It was his grandmother's kindness and care that helped us get through it. She was the best person in the Pei family, the one who treated me the best. Now, she was suffering from Alzheimer's. I didn't want her to sense any tension between Willard and me and worry about it. So, I endured his touch and forced a smile. Grandma. She looked at us holding hands and smiled warmly. Willard, seeing that I didn't reject him, also smiled slightly. Apart from his grandmother, Willard had a mother. But my relationship with her was average. At the dinner table, she briefly mentioned Grandma's health. Then changed the topic to Willard and me. You two have been married for so long, when are you having kids? Willard and I sat on the same side. When I heard this question, I caught a glimpse of his slightly stunned expression. This is an issue that inevitably comes up at every family gathering. But in the past, Willard would always choose to skip over it or brush it off. But this time, he carefully picked the bones out of the fish and responded with a short answer. I'm already preparing it. His mother and grandmother were both a little surprised and pleased by this. But I couldn't help but frown and glance at him. Willard didn't respond to my gaze, but instead placed the boneless fish in my bowl. What's going on with him? I pushed the fish aside and coldly spoke up. Look again, I don't want to get angry right now. The table fell silent at my words. What do you mean by that? Saying things like this in front of the elders. After we got home, Willard grabbed my hand, his tone filled with restrained coldness. I could feel his anger, so I countered. Did I say something wrong? Wasn't that how he answered before? Maybe it was the cold sarcasm in my eyes that made him pause. Willard tightened his grip, his gaze locking onto me, as though trying to read my mind. Miranda, you said that on purpose, didn't you? You're angry. His voice softened a bit, tinged with helplessness. Is it because of that photo? If it is, I can explain. Hearing him bring it up again, I decided to meet his gaze directly. What's there to explain? Willard was at a loss for words. Was he going to say it was just a dare or a prank? Who would believe that? I decided to remind him. You don't need to explain to me, but Grandma is in poor health. Make sure you keep your little secrets well hidden. Willard hadn't lacked other women by his side before. But the relationships were too short-lived. There was no evidence to pursue. Except this time, he posted it on Instagram. Even though he deleted it quickly, there was no guarantee it wouldn't get back to the elders. When he heard what I said, Willard's eyes flashed with surprise. He studied my face intently. Suddenly, as if realizing something, he let out a cold laugh. Your tactics have improved, Miranda. This time, I was the one who was puzzled. Just then, Willard's assistant called. Willard. The air between us was tense and silent, making Ethel's sweet, soft tone seem all the more obvious. I didn't catch everything she said, but I heard half a sentence. Can you come keep me company? The emotions in Willard's eyes were obscure. For a moment, they seemed to pass over me. I'm on my way. He responded, and the girl on the other end of the phone immediately sounded cheerful. Willard gave me a deep look, then turned and left. That night, Willard didn't come home. He didn't lack places to stay, and I no longer worried like I used to. The irony was, I didn't go looking for Willard. But his assistant, Ethel, came looking for me. Miss Miranda, I came to get some clothes for Mr. Willard. The next day, Ethel was standing at my door. When she saw me, a deliberately pleasant smile spread across her face. Is he on a business trip? I asked. If Willard were on a business trip, his secretary would have notified me in advance and come to collect his luggage. Someone like Ethel showing up uninvited was a first. She entered our master bedroom with ease. She was picking and organizing Willard's clothes. When she heard my question, Ethel turned to look at me. Her beautiful eyes gleamed with clear provocation. He's not on a business trip. If he wasn't on a business trip, that meant he was staying somewhere else. I almost immediately understood. Ethel smirked triumphantly. Miss Miranda, if you find anything left behind, you'll have to bring it over. I smiled back. I turned and went into Willard's study, grabbing a photo frame, and placed it on top of the clothes she was sorting. Don't forget this. Ethel immediately saw the photo of Willard with someone else. The person in the photo wasn't me, nor was it her. Willard treasures this. Be careful not to break it. Who is she? Ethel's tone became cold. I smiled. Willard's first love. Funny enough, you resemble her quite a bit. But compared to the others, you're still a bit lacking. Ethel's expression froze, the smug look she had earlier faltering. She left in a huff, frustrated and angry. Afterwards, she probably realized her behavior was less than ideal. She sent me a message. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to stir things up between me and Willard, but I won't fall for it. I shrugged in indifference. But to Ethel, it seemed like I was ignoring her and declaring war. So, she cracked. The result was that she posted several photos of herself with Willard on Instagram over the next few days. The captions were overly poetic. So happy to be your harbor. I knew Ethel was trying to provoke me. So, when she posted another photo with Willard, I couldn't help but remind her. Don't you realize that these photos you're sending me are evidence of you being Willard's mistress? She went silent. A few minutes later, she deleted all the photos. I couldn't help but laugh. Everyone laughs at you, but you're the one who looks the most foolish. Ethel fell quiet. I didn't expect to see her again for a while. But a few days later, I ran into her again. This time, it was completely by accident. A longtime professor friend, Sydney, invited me out for a meal. He also showed me around his school. While we were there, we happened to run into the arts festival, where Ethel was standing at the entrance with a welcoming banner. When she saw me, her expression flickered with a mix of emotions. In the end, she had to bow her head and greet me. Good afternoon, please follow me. Do you know her? After she left, Sydney asked me. I hadn't expected him to be so perceptive, so I laughed lightly. I've seen her around Willard. I spoke vaguely, but Sydney furrowed his brow. You and Willard. I don't have many close friends, but they all know how much I care about Willard. They've seen how I truly feel about him. And now, I faced it all calmly and peacefully. Sydney looked at me with a growing sense of pity. It was supposed to be a joyful reunion with an old friend. But with the way he was looking at me, I ended up comforting him instead. It's fine. Don't let it ruin our mood. I meant it. A reunion with a friend, what could be more important than that? Sydney was left uncertain whether to laugh or to offer admiration. You're still the same as before. Unfortunately, midway through, he had an urgent task and had to cancel our meal together. I'm really sorry. Once I'm done, I'll treat you to a meal, to make it up to you. It's fine. The small incident with Ethel was quickly pushed to the back of my mind. But Sydney stayed busy for an entire week. When I got his call again, he said, Miranda, can you come over now? His tone was serious, and not at all like he was inviting me out for a meal. I drove to the location Sydney had sent and entered the private room. When I opened the door, I froze. In the room, besides Sydney, there was Willard, Ethel, and several others. Miranda. Sydney stood up and walked toward me. I asked, what's going on? He smiled and turned toward the others. Now that both parties are here, why don't we all talk about it? It's not good to only hear one side of the story, right? Willard's expression was dark. Ethel's gaze was evasive. The other people in the room looked awkward. Finally, after Sydney's explanation, I finally understood the whole situation. Sydney attended a friend's birthday party. Unexpectedly, Willard and Ethel showed up halfway through. At first, Sydney didn't think much of it. But then, Willard started making an issue out of it. He asked Sydney why she rejected Ethel's application for postgraduate research. Ethel was a hardworking and outstanding young woman. She hoped Sydney would reconsider and reverse her decision. She applied to be under my supervision, hoping that I would accept her as a student, Sydney explained. Then Sydney rejected her, and that's when Willard started speaking. But even after Willard spoke, Sydney still refused. It wasn't a big deal. The problem was that when Sydney clearly stated she wouldn't take Ethel as a student. Ethel suddenly stood up, looking hurt, and said, "Professor Sydney, is it because of Miranda that you won't accept me as your student? At the last arts festival, I saw her with you. I don't know what she said to you, but you shouldn't just crush a student's dream like this." As soon as Ethel mentioned my name, the room instantly went quiet. No one expected this issue to be related to me. And Willard's gaze towards Sydney turned cold, filled with contempt. "Are you close with Miranda?" "Somewhat," Sydney answered honestly. Ethel's eyes filled with tears, and she stood next to Willard, looking like she'd been wronged. "So, did Miranda tell you to do this?" Sydney. Due to Ethel's one-sided story and Willard's unfounded accusations against me, Sydney couldn't stand it anymore. So, he called me and asked me to confront them directly. After hearing the full story, I was just as speechless as Sydney. At this point, Sydney turned back to Ethel. "This young lady, the reason I'm not accepting you has nothing to do with Miranda. Don't spread false accusations." Ethel still wasn't convinced. "Why? My grades are excellent, and my GPA is perfect. What gives you the right to reject me?" Sydney's smile vanished, and his expression turned serious. "Because under my guidance, I don't accept students with bad character." As soon as Sydney finished speaking, Ethel's face went deathly pale. The others in the room wished they could sink into the ground. The message was crystal clear. After the warning, Sydney's face softened back into his usual calm and kind demeanor. "Let's go. I'll buy you dinner." I nodded, looking at Willard and Ethel. I was about to leave with Sydney. But just as I was about to turn away, Ethel's frantic voice echoed behind me. "You're accusing me of having bad character? What about you? Miranda is a married woman, and you're still having an affair with her." The room froze in shock, and it was dead quiet. Sydney frowned and turned back. Ethel glared at him in anger. "Huh. I've hit a nerve, haven't I?" Ethel screamed. The sound of a glass shattering echoed loudly. She bent down to avoid it, staring at the shards of glass scattered on the floor. The rest of her words were lost in my icy stare. Ethel shivered, fear in her eyes as she looked at me. I walked towards her. She recoiled, nervously inching closer to Willard. Just as I was nearly a step away from her, Willard furrowed his brows and blocked my path. "Miranda, that's enough." He scolded me, his voice tinged with frustration. How laughable. Just moments ago, when Ethel was slandering me, he said nothing. Now, when I'm just warning Ethel, he immediately steps in. I looked at Willard coldly. He said, "I know you're still mad at me. We're even now." "Even?" I sneered. "Willard, your thoughts are disgusting, and your actions are immoral. Don't think I'm like you. It makes me sick." Willard's face turned ashen. I pulled Ethel toward me and slapped her twice across the face. One slap for trying to seduce my husband, and one for slandering my friend. She covered her cheek, looking shocked and furious as she glared at me. I glanced at Willard and told Ethel, "The things you're fighting for aren't even things I care about. If you want them, take them. No thanks necessary." Finally, I gave a mocking smile. Willard suddenly grabbed my wrist, his voice panicked. "Miranda! What are you doing? Can't you understand? I don't want you anymore. I want a divorce." I said it firmly, word by word. After we left, Sydney took me home. He looked at my dark, cold face and carefully spoke. "Miranda, when people are angry, they sometimes say things in the heat of the moment." "You mean when I said I wanted a divorce?" Sydney didn't deny it. I smiled lightly. "I wasn't acting out of anger, and you don't need to feel guilty. This has nothing to do with you. Love is like a cup of water with cracks. It leaks a little every day, and eventually, it will be empty. and Willard never noticed or tried to fix it. So, little by little, my feelings for him disappeared. Sydney didn't try to comfort me anymore. He simply said, "Good luck." When I got home, I sorted through the things I had packed. During the time Willard wasn't around, I finally had the space to discard old things. Just then, I received a call from Willard's mother. Her first question was, "What's going on with you and Willard now?" Apparently, she had somehow learned that Willard and I were having problems. "I knew something was off the last time you came back. Miranda, you need to stop throwing tantrums. Who could tolerate you acting like this?" I didn't have a particularly good relationship with Willard's mother. A big part of the reason was because Willard didn't like me. But I had no choice. Willard married me because his mother insisted. I could hear the sarcasm in her voice. And the endless expectations she had for how I should treat her son. Mississippi. I couldn't hold back, so I interrupted her. She paused, surprised. "Did you just call me miss?" I didn't answer her question. Instead, I said, "If you can't stand me, then let your son divorce me." "What?" Willard's mother was left confused on the other end of the line. Half an hour later, Willard arrived home. At that moment, I had just placed the divorce papers on the coffee table. Willard looked at me, pushing my suitcase, and a flash of panic crossed his face. He quickly stepped forward and blocked my way. "Miranda, stop this nonsense." He warned me in a low voice, his handsome face showing subtle dissatisfaction. "I'm not being foolish. The divorce papers are already signed." I pointed to the papers. He looked at them, his face changing slightly. "You're serious about this?" he asked. "Is this because of Ethel? If you don't like her, I'll get rid of her. I won't contact her again, I promise." He swore to me. To this day, he still didn't understand. The real problem between us wasn't Ethel. I didn't want to argue with him anymore. I pushed his hand away, opened the door, and left. "Remember to sign the papers." Willard didn't sign, of course. The news that we were getting a divorce quickly spread. Willard's friends came to try and convince me, but I ignored every one of them. Aside from that, Willard was also doing everything he could to try and fix things. After leaving home that day, I went to find a friend. I took a quiet job in their studio as a temporary transition. Starting from the third day, the studio began receiving flowers and lunch boxes. No names were given, just messages saying they were for me. "Who sent these?" my friend asked, seeing my expression. "Could it be Willard?" I didn't confirm or deny it. It wasn't hard for him to find out my address. My friend sneered. If I had known it would end up like this, I wouldn't have gotten involved in the first place. I had once thrown myself into the whirlwind of loving Willard. But my friends, who saw it all from the outside, had realized much earlier that something wasn't right. I threw the flowers Willard sent straight into the trash. As for the food, there were a few stray animals in the garden below the studio. Sticking to my principle of not wasting things while doing a good deed, I fed the food to the strays. To my surprise, I ran into Ethel there. "Miranda, are you happy now?" She glared at me, as if I had done something unforgivable. From the resentment in her words, I gathered that she had been fired by Willard. Not only that, Willard had even had his office thoroughly cleaned. The toys for the cats were removed, and on his desk, there was a photo of him and me. And, because Sydney had rejected Ethel's request for a recommendation, people began speculating that something had gone wrong. Before long, someone dug up the affair between Ethel and Willard. Now Ethel had lost her job. And she was being shunned and isolated at school. Unable to accept this, she came to find me. "If it weren't for you, how would I have ended up like this?" Ethel complained, drawing the attention of several onlookers. I found it laughable and even more mocking. "Everything you're facing now, you brought upon yourself. You're lying. It's all your fault. You become Mrs. Pay now, what more do you want? Why did you have to ruin me?" Ethel wouldn't listen. I couldn't be bothered to argue with her. I made a direct call to Willard. "Come and take your mistress away." 20 minutes later, Willard arrived. He rushed out of the car, ignoring Ethel completely, and came straight to me. "Miranda. Take her away." It seemed Willard had only just noticed Ethel. He frowned. I didn't ask her to come find you. I didn't want to listen to his explanation and turned to leave. Behind me, I could hear Willard scolding Ethel and her pleading cries. Liars. You said you liked me. Ethel accused. Willard looked at her indifferently. Even so, no one compares to her. Ethel froze in place. Willard warned Ethel not to bother me again, and then had her taken away. Although Ethel left, Willard still stood downstairs, unwilling to leave. This scene happened to be seen by a friend from the studio upstairs. He was very unhappy and threw a bucket of water down. How unlucky. I had originally thought that after this, Willard would give up and sign the divorce papers. But a few days later, I received a call from his grandmother. You haven't visited me in so long. When will you come back? I could avoid seeing Willard and his mother. But I couldn't ignore his grandmother. I went back to the old house, and unexpectedly, Willard was there too. He was pushing his grandmother's wheelchair, looking at me with a gentle expression and a smile. You're here, Grandma. Grandma happily took my hand and started chatting away, saying all sorts of things. I listened patiently. Willard sat beside us. Miranda, you don't have a boyfriend, right? Look, this is my grandson. Isn't he handsome? Grandma suddenly said. Willard and I both froze. We knew she was having another episode. Do you like him? If you do, Grandma will introduce him to you. Grandma. Willard interrupted helplessly, smiling as he explained to her in the face of her confused gaze. I'm already married to her. She's your granddaughter-in-law now. Oh? Really? Grandma asked, looking at me. Willard's gaze was also full of hope. In the end, I nodded. Ha ha ha, good, good, granddaughter-in-law, granddaughter-in-law. Willard, you have to treat her well, understand? Grandma finished instructing Willard and then turned to me. Miranda, if this boy bullies you, just tell Grandma, I'll smack him. She held my hand and entwined it with Willard's. I wanted to pull away, but Willard held my hand tightly. I had planned to find a suitable opportunity to tell Grandma about my situation with Willard when she was lucid. But the elderly woman was confused all day and went to bed early that evening. It seemed Willard had sensed my thoughts and found me. I had already guessed what he wanted to talk about. Sure enough, Willard asked if we could hold off on the divorce for now. The doctor said Grandma's health isn't good and she can't be upset. Miranda, can we delay the divorce for now? His eyes were full of pleading, and his expression even seemed somewhat humble. A heavy weight pressed on my chest, leaving me speechless. Willard and I resumed a temporary reconciliation. Whenever Willard had free time, he'd take me to the old house to accompany Grandma. Life seemed to be turning into what I had expected. One day, Willard once again took me to his grandmother's house. But this time, he suddenly said to Grandma, Grandma, next week we won't have dinner with you. Ah? Why? Willard smiled. Next week is our third wedding anniversary. He said he had made a reservation. When he mentioned the date, I paused for a moment. Willard wasn't someone who cared much about formalities. And because our wedding anniversary was special, Willard had never liked to mention it. I remembered the first year after our wedding when I eagerly prepared a surprise, only to be coldly interrupted by him. Now, he was the one bringing it up, and I couldn't help but frown. Just as I was about to speak, Willard suddenly took my hand. When I looked at him in surprise, Grandma had already clapped her hands happily. Good, good, you two go ahead, don't worry about me. On the way back, I couldn't help but say to Willard, Willard, don't forget, we're in the middle of a divorce. Yes, even with Grandma around, I still hadn't given up on divorcing Willard. But I could agree to keep it a secret from her. Willard gripped the steering wheel. I know, but I want to have a proper meal with you. Just this once, please? His eyes were pleading, and his demeanor seemed almost submissive. I fell silent. When he saw my consent, Willard's mood improved over the next few days. He started leaving early and returning late. Anyone with eyes could tell he was preparing for that day. But unfortunately, the anniversary never came to pass. A few days before, I ran into Ethel again. Unlike the last time, when she had been disheveled and irrational, This time, she lifted her chin arrogantly when she saw me. Looking for Willard? He's not here. I'm not looking for him, I'm looking for you. Looking for me? I'm pregnant. At that moment, it wasn't exactly like being struck by a thunderbolt, but I was still deeply shaken. I looked at Ethel in disbelief. There was a gleam of pride and satisfaction in her eyes. I snapped back to reality. Oh, congratulations. I turned to leave, but Ethel stopped me. Did you not hear me? I said I'm pregnant. She grabbed my arm, but I shook her off. What does your pregnancy have to do with me? The child is Willard's. Then go to him. I'm not the father. I couldn't help but snap at her. But suddenly, Ethel dropped to her knees in front of me. He won't let me keep the child, so I had no choice but to come to you. Come to me? What was I supposed to do? I felt a mix of anger and absurdity. Ethel said, Miranda, I know I've wronged you, but my child can't grow up without a father. I beg you, talk to Willard, please let me keep this child. She pleaded, clinging to my arm. Her pull made my mind spin. I don't know where the anger came from, but it surged up, flooding my head. It was anger at Ethel, but mostly at Willard. Just then, Willard came back. He rushed toward Ethel as soon as he got out of the car, pulling her up from the ground. What are you doing here? He scolded. Ethel was in tears. Willard, please, let me keep the child. Willard looked at me in panic. Miranda. I finally managed to free myself from the chaos. But my mind was still tangled in it. I turned back to Willard, coldly staring at him. Deal with your own problems. Grandma's still sleeping, don't wake her. Willard's face turned pale. Ethel was still begging, her sobs echoing in my ears. I felt like my head might explode. Willard's gaze turned colder as he gripped Ethel's arm tightly. I already told you, I'll give you some money as compensation. Why do you have to come and involve my family? But this is your child. I won't acknowledge it. Her words were silenced by the coldness in his eyes. Willard said, don't push me. Ethel seemed as though her soul had been sucked out of her as she stared at Willard, confused. At that moment, I actually felt sorry for her. Ethel glared at Willard and me with resentment. Just then, I heard Grandma's voice from behind. What's going on? Why all the noise? Willard and I both turned around. Suddenly, a figure quickly moved between us. With a loud thud, Ethel fell to her knees in front of Grandma. Grandma. I'm pregnant. The child is Willard's. What do you mean Willard's? I already have a daughter-in-law. They're getting divorced. Willard cheated. I'm his true love. As soon as Ethel finished speaking, Grandma's body shook violently, and she looked up at me and Willard. Hospital. When his mother arrived, she didn't speak before slapping him hard across the face. Bastard. How could I have given birth to such an ungrateful son? Willard didn't say anything. His mother then looked at me, as if she had something to say, but stopped herself. She only asked how Grandma was doing. She's still under observation. The air grew heavy with silence. Half an hour later, the doctor came out. The patient is awake. Family members may visit, but please don't stay too long. All right. Willard and his mother rushed into the room. I followed them and immediately saw Grandma lying weakly on the bed. When she heard us, she opened her eyes and, after a brief glance at Willard's mother and him, her gaze fixed on me. Come here. She gestured for me to come closer. I didn't dare speak and hesitated before stepping forward. Seeing the cloudy yet kind light in her eyes, I finally mustered up the courage to take her hand. Grandma. At this moment, she was unusually awake, looking at me with a tender, affectionate gaze. Why didn't you tell me you were suffering so much? I shook my head, tears falling as I felt deeply guilty. Maybe I should have told her the truth earlier, so she wouldn't have to bear this blow. It's not your fault. It's Willard who's wronged you. At the mention of Willard, her body trembled slightly. He stepped forward and kneeled by her bed. I'm sorry, Grandma. It's all my fault. Grandma looked at him with a mix of disappointment and sorrow. We didn't dare disturb her any longer. We quickly left the room. Willard's mother had a dark look on her face. First, clean up your mess. Don't show up in front of Grandma for a while. Oh, I almost forgot about Ethel. As the one directly responsible for Grandma's hospitalization, Willard had lost all patience with her. After Willard stormed off, his mother turned to look at me. She seemed like she wanted to say something but hesitated. Finally, she sighed and said to me, "You should go rest now." In the following days, although I didn't see Willard and Ethel, I still heard updates about them through mutual friends. After the old lady was hospitalized, Ethel went into hiding. She was terrified that Willard would take revenge on her, so she didn't dare show up. But eventually, Willard found her. She was so shocked that she had a miscarriage. By the time Willard found her, she was too scared to even go to the hospital. One of my friends relayed the news to me. I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. 3 days later, the old lady gradually regained consciousness and was getting better. I went to visit her, and there I ran into Willard. We both silently agreed not to bring up the divorce again. But that day, Grandma suddenly asked, "Are you and Willard getting a divorce?" Both Willard and I froze. I didn't want to deceive her any longer, so I nodded. Yes. Willard, standing beside me, trembled slightly, and I could feel his vulnerability, as though he couldn't hide his pain. I had expected Grandma to offer some advice or try to mediate, but instead, she just sighed deeply. "All right, I respect your decision. I was the one who brought you two together. Now that you're parting ways, I won't say anything more." She took my hand in hers, her voice rough and hoarse. "Miranda, you will always be the child I love." Tears welled up in my eyes, and my throat tightened. After Grandma fell asleep, Willard and I left the hospital room. By now, there was no need for us to pretend anymore. "You can sign the divorce papers now," I said. Willard suddenly looked up, his eyes red. "Miranda, can we not get divorced?" He rested his head on my shoulder, his arms around me as though he were trying to merge our bodies, his voice hoarse and desperate. "I was wrong. I love you. Can we start over?" When I loved Willard, I longed to hear him say these exact words in return. But now that he had said what I once wanted to hear, my heart felt nothing. When I liked him, he liked someone else, his white moonlight. When we got married, I thought he loved me too. But the ghost of his white moonlight always lingered between us, and the gap between us only grew. As time passed, he fell in love with her replacement. For 3 years, we had been cordial, but distant, living together in name only, and eventually, it all ended in a sad conclusion. I remained silent. Willard knew by then that I was resolute. Warm tears fell on my neck. Willard finally signed the divorce papers. He transferred 80% of his assets to me. "It's my fault. No amount of compensation can make up for it," he said. Soon, Grandma found out about our divorce. She closed her eyes with a deep sigh of regret. The day I signed the divorce papers happened to be our 3rd wedding anniversary. The restaurant called to check with Willard. "Sir, do you still need anything else for the private room you reserved?" "No, it's fine. Just cancel everything." "Ah?" Willard lowered his head and spoke softly. "My wife and I are getting divorced. We won't need it anymore." There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by an awkward click as the call ended. Later, Willard asked me, "Miranda, do you think we could still be friends?" I frowned. "Let's not. It's probably best if we never see each other again." After that, we never saw each other again, just as I had hoped. The only time we crossed paths again was 6 months later, at Grandma's funeral. I packed up the divorce papers and left, only to receive a call from Sydney along the way. "Got time? Want to grab a bite?" "Sure. I'll come pick you up." From the shadows into the sunlight. A gentle breeze, a clear sky. Everything was a fresh start. And,